O surpreendente mundo do romance. Como uma história de amor pode provocar sensações na mente dos leitores?
O Fronteiras do Pensamento de hoje apresenta a primeira parte da conferência O Romance no Novo Mundo, com Orham Pamuk.
O professor e romancista turco comenta como a mente se comporta quando está lendo um romance e critica a noção de realidade nesse processo de leitura.
Imaginação. Como a literatura inspira as nossas mentes a imaginarem novas e fascinantes cenas?
E no romance, até que ponto o escritor torna-se aquilo que escreve?
Com vocês, Orham Pamuk.
Oops. Thank you for coming. I'm very pleased and honored to be in Porto Alegre. I was around the town, in the town, I'm sorry. I was around the town, in the town, looked around and saw what a wonderful city it is, especially the flora, the geography, and I see that it's getting really rich and successful in a way. I was in Brazil, I think in 2006, almost more than 5 years ago, and I saw that Brazil is getting rich and rich and rich. Of course, it's a problem whether the whole nation is benefiting from this growth or only a few are benefiting from this, but my subject of my talk is not that. My subject of my talk is that just like Turkey, Brazil is getting richer, and a new middle classes are being formed in so many corners of the world. In India, in Turkey, in China, in Brazil, in Mexico, a new middle classes are forming. In West, they say new emerging markets. Perhaps I want to underline another aspect of this new development, new emerging, perhaps humanity, literatures, and I want to address what we can do with this new situation, what is happening, and what can literature do with this. In order to understand this, I will talk about my art, the art of the novel, and how art of the novel can address, respond, explore, get in touch with what is happening in this new emerging markets. Of course, I don't see my culture or Brazilian culture as a market, but something new is happening, and I want to address this, what we can do with novels. I'm a novelist. I look at the world through a novelist's window. Anything that is interesting for me, in a way, is interesting if I can put that in a novel. But I will assure you that you can put in a novel everything. But in order to understand, in order to address these issues in this tonight, first I will briefly talk, then I will try to understand your questions, answer your questions. I will read a bit of a serious essay that I wrote and pin down these new developments one by one and try to analyze, try to say something about them, so things that we can do, things that we can address, how we can address this new situation. But in order to do that, I will just revisit the concept of the novel, what we do when we read a novel. When we read a novel, we do lots of operations in our mind. We are not aware of them, but I will now count them one by one so that address this new development through them. When we read a novel, our mind and our perception works intently, with great concentration. carrying out numerous operations simultaneously. But many of us no longer even realize that we are carrying out these operations. We are like someone driving a car who is unaware that he is pushing knobs, depressing pedals, turning the wheel carefully, and in accordance with many rules, reading and interpreting road signs and checking the traffic while he drives. The analogy of the driver is valid not only for the reader, but also for the novelist. Some novelists are unaware of the techniques they are using. They write spontaneously, as if carrying out a perfectly natural act, oblivious to the operations and calculations they are performing in their head, and to the fact that they are using the gears, brakes, and knobs that the art of the novel equips them with. In order to understand how novels work on us, let us carefully list the most important actions that take place in our minds when we read a novel. Just like a driver who is doing so many things, and they drive, push them, and then also they have a conversation with us, and we are, how can he drive and do this? Writing a novel, or reading a novel, we also do so many operations. Reading a novel entails performing these operations. Such a list, what we do, will remind us what the novel actually is, something we know, but we may well have forgotten. Here are the operations our mind performs when we read a novel. This is a list I did. In fact, I published a book in English. It's called The Naive and the Sentimental Novelist. It's also published here in Brazil by my publisher. The ideas are the same, but I now convert these ideas to address to this new emerging humanity. When we read a novel, these are obvious things. You will say, why Pamuk is telling us all that? We know that, but we know that, but we have forgotten them. First, we observe the general scene and follow the narrative. In the book he wrote on Cervantes' Don Quixote, Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset says that we read adventure novels, chivalric novels, cheap novels to see what happens next. But we read the modern novel, he meant what we today call the literary novel, for its atmosphere. According to Ortega y Gasset, the atmosphere novel is something more valuable, while what he calls cheap novels, spy novels, detective novels, pink love novels, science fiction, so forth and so on, we read them to turn the page. I argue that actually these genre fictions and high literary fiction are coming together. Second, the story as we read the novel, the story slowly emerges out of many pictures, objects, descriptions, sounds, conversations, fantasies, memories, sometimes essays on history, pictures, comments, bits of information, thoughts, events, scenes, and moments. A novel, as we all know, is a big structure that holds all of these. That sometimes we go to history, sometimes we have little snapshots, little details of life, sometimes we have fantasies. The novelist all composes, arranges, explores these things and puts them in a shape so as to, it's not a one integral thing, but it's made up of so many things. When we read all of them, sometimes we go to past, sometimes we experience something very private, sometimes we see social scenes, sometimes we see more mountain-like essays, this or that. When we read them, we also, a part of our mind is busy following the story. What is following the story? To derive pleasure from a novel is to enjoy the act of departing from words and converting them into pictures. This is perhaps because I wanted to be a painter in my childhood, in my teenage years. I always see the art of the novel as the novelist writes some words, the reader reads these words and forms picture in his or her imagination. Actually, even before writing the words, the novelist has some pictures in his mind. He also, just like a film director, sees the scene in his mind's imagination, then converts this scene to words and puts them in a paper. Then sometime later, it's edited, this and that happens, it's printed, the reader reads it, then the reader invents his picture, her picture in his imagination. This I'm telling all because reading a novel is a very active thing. If the reader doesn't have any imagination, the novelist disappears. Another thing we do is, as we read a novel, let me count them one by one. The third thing we do, our mind wonders how much of the story the writer tells is real experience and how much is imagination. This is one of the eternal questions of both the reader and the writer. We ask this question especially in the parts of the novel that arouse our wonder, admiration, and amazement. To read a novel is to wonder constantly, even at moments when we lose ourselves most deeply in the book. How much of this is fantasy and how much is real? Let me give an example. I published in Turkey a novel called Museum of Innocence. And actually, this is also published here, I think, in September. This novel is concerned with, among other things, the actions and feelings of a man called Kemal, who is deeply and obsessively in love. It wasn't long before I began receiving the following question from a number of readers, very many actually, who apparently thought that his love was described in a highly realistic manner. Especially women readers asked me this: Mr. Pamuk, did all this actually happen to you? Mr. Pamuk, are you Kemal? Anyone who writes novels know this, and anyone who reads novels, although they know that it's fiction, cannot stop asking, at least privately, to himself. So now, let me give my two contradictory answers, both of which I believe sincerely. When a reader asks me, Mr. Pamuk, are you Kemal? Of course, implying that, did you ever fall in love that foolishly? Are you that stupidly in love? How can you write about the details of love in so much extravagantly if you did not fall in love? Perhaps you are Kemal, perhaps you are confessing. This is a classical reaction to any novel, and this is a tradition of the novel. So my answer to this question is, first answer, and I have two contradictory answers. First, no, I am not my hero Kemal. Obvious. Second, but it would be impossible for me to ever convince readers of my novel that I am not Kemal. Why? The second answer, that it's impossible for me to convince that you readers that I am not Kemal, suggests that it would be difficult for me, as it so often is for novelists, to convince my readers that they should not equate me with my protagonist. At the same time, it also implies that I do not intend to exert a great deal of effort to prove I am not Kemal. In fact, I wrote the novel knowing very well that my readers would think that Kemal was me. Actually, somewhere in the back of my mind, I wanted my readers to think that I was Kemal. If you believe that I am Kemal, I would think, well, I'm a good writer. I convinced them all. Yes, I intended my novel to be perceived as a work of fiction, as a product of my imagination or any imagination. Yet, I also wanted readers to assume that the main characters and the story were true. And I did not feel at all like a hypocrite or a trickster for harboring such contradictory desires. I have learned through experience that the art of the writing a novel is to feel these contradictory desires deeply, but to peacefully continuing writing unperturbed. That is, when I write my novel, I know that many readers will say, "Oh, you lived this. I know." And then sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But you have to continue writing. When Daniel Defoe published Robinson Crusoe, he concealed the fact that the story was fiction born of his imagination. He read something in the newspaper and invented the whole story, and the newspaper was not, whatever he saw there, he was not true to that too. Then later, he claimed that it was a true story. Someone lived it. No one lived it, actually. And admitted, and then when it emerged that his novel was a lie, that no one lived that, he became embarrassed and admitted, though only to a certain extent, the fictionality of his story. For many, he was one of the examples, early examples or early victims of Mr. Defoe, did you live all this question? For many hundred years, from Don Quixote or even the tale of Genji or to Robinson Crusoe, Moby Dick, and the literature of today, writers and readers have been trying unsuccessfully to come to some agreement on the nature of the novel's fictionality. I argue that, in fact, the novel works because the readers and writers do not agree upon what is fictional, what is real. Also, there are other reasons, in especially countries where there was political repression, where narrow-minded conservatism pressures the writer. We write the things that we want to say, and then we say, well, I didn't. These are not my opinions. These are the opinions of my characters. This is sexuality is not what I believe. This is what is in the novel. This is all fiction. That is, we use the idea of fiction to shield us, to protect ourselves against repression. Let me tell you a story. Not long after the Museum of Innocence was published in Istanbul, I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen in years, a professor with whom I discussed such matters from time to time. Thinking he would offer some sympathy, I complained that everyone was asking, "Are you Kemal, Mr. Pamuk? Are you Kemal Orhan?" And then we chatted about this as we walked through the streets of Nişantaşı, where many of my novels takes place. We recalled, for example, Rousseau's The Confessions, where he complained about the reactions to his novels. Actually, Rousseau wrote, more or less, in English, what I will read here. What made women so favorable to me was their persuasion that I had written my own story and that I myself was the hero of this novel. And Rousseau is mid-18th century. My gentle friend brought up the Arab poet Abu Nawas, who I mention in my novel, The Black Book, in the chapter entitled Three Musketeers, a heterosexual who wrote as if he were a homosexual, thinking that this is an interesting subject. And he told me that over the centuries, many Chinese writers had adopted female personas in their works, like a pair of non-Western intellectuals who are forever complaining about the lack of sophistication of their fellow countrymen. We discussed with no great concern how readers' interest in gossip was encouraged by the newspapers and how this was preventing people in Turkey from acquiring a Western understanding of fiction and the novel. Just then, my old friend stopped in front of an apartment building opposite the mosque, the mosque in my neighborhood. I stopped as well and looked at him quizzically. "I thought you were going home," he said. "I am, but I don't live here," I replied. "Really?" said the professor friend. "I figured from your novel that your hero Kemal lived here with his mother." He smiled at his mistake. "I must have unconsciously assumed that You too had moved here with your mother. We smiled at each other for confusing fiction with reality. We smiled like old men who have reached the point where they can take anything in. We sensed that we had fallen under this illusion not because we had forgotten that novels are based on imagination just as much as on fact, but because novels impose this illusion upon readers. And now we also began to perceive that we like to read novels precisely for this purpose, in order to blend the imaginary with the real. Also, to tell the truth and say that it is not fiction. And also, to tell fiction and to tell its reality. Why do we do this? Why do I choose a form in which I tell a real truth and say it's fiction, and I say real fiction and pose as if truth? I think we all like this ambiguity, and that's what makes novels so powerful. A logical paradox exists between, on the one hand, the experience of losing oneself in the novel and naively thinking it's real, and on the other, one's curiosity about the extent of fantasy it contains. This is my strong point, but the power of the vitality of the art of the novel stems from its unique logic and from its reliance on this type of conflict.
Você assistiu à primeira parte da conferência O Romance no Novo Mundo, com Orham Pamuk. Na semana que vem, você confere a segunda parte dessa palestra.
Obrigado pela sua companhia e até o próximo Fronteiras do Pensamento.